Hi, everybody. This is Philip Martin, and I'm here with Audi, who doesn't like storms on this stormy, actually Tuesday afternoon. We're getting around to this a little bit later than we normally do. Welcome to On Film, on video, and this will be a short one. I just want to bring a couple of things to your attention. Boy, we are stuffed this week, and it's funny how that happens because in a normal year, a normal circumstances when we're not locked down like this, when movie theaters are open, we're sort of driven by whatever is opening at the theater that Friday. And there's this time of year, especially middle of June, you generally have one big movie every weekend, and maybe another one that's kind of counter programmed against it, and that's basically it. And we cover the movies, so if that's what's going on, that's what's going on. So we will endeavor to review the big movie and maybe get an interview, and review the other movie and maybe get an interview. And we might have trouble sometimes actually filling out. Well, hello. Paris is here. Hello, Paris. Paris is making a guest appearance. I didn't think I'd have any dog at first, but yeah, the storm got him up here. But what was I saying? I was talking about how we're driven by whatever is happening. Every week there's a movie that we have to pay attention to, and maybe there's only one or two movies in a week, and that makes things pretty thin for us sometimes. Well, on this week, when there's not a big movie opening in theaters, we just have all kinds of stuff. I'm not even sure what's going to get in the section this week. We have an interview with the director of Shirley, Josephine Decker, who did Madeline last year, by the way, and I didn't even realize that she was the same director when I wrote about it, which was, stupid, I guess. I mean, I should have probably researched a little bit more than that. Dan Liebarger talked to her. We also have Dan talking about the 60th anniversary of The Apartment, which we may push to next week. So if it's not in the paper today, we've pushed it in the next week. We have me writing about Ghostbusters, which is back in theaters this week. We have Piers Marchant writing about You Should Have Left, which opened last week, but we didn't get it in time to get a review last week. But since it is a movie of some note, Kevin Bacon, Amanda Seyfried, we're going to run it this week. Okay. I'm reviewing a movie called Baby Teeth, which is probably our lead. And there's a couple other things. Irresistible is opening this week, but I don't think we're going to have anything on it this week. We'll have it on next week because, again, nobody is tied to these opening dates anymore. Even though Irresistible will be on your streaming services Friday, there's no particular need to rush out and see it. So you can see it next week, or you can see it the week after, or whenever. Which leads me to kind of an interesting idea that I've sort of had, and it's been floating around for a while, because I think for maybe the past 20 years, most of us probably didn't see most of the movies that we watch in theaters. I mean, we've been watching them on VHS tapes and then on DVDs and on cable channels like HBO. When's the last time I watched a movie on HBO? I watched Bad Education, but I'm talking about a movie that was in theaters first. I can't really remember because, well, my situation's different. I see a lot of movies in theaters, and then I see a lot of DVDs of movies. So, but we watch them differently now. But in the 80s, in the 70s, basically we saw most of our movies in theaters. And I've had this theory for a long time, and I don't think it's totally unique to me. I mean, I think I've heard other people express this thought. But what you think is the best of pop culture, the best movies, the best music, the best books, came out when you were about 12 years old. And the reason that happens is because that's the age when you're just becoming aware of all this wonderful pop culture stuff and how it can fit into your life. And it's also a little bit because I think, especially movies, to some extent music, but especially movies, they sort of gear it to that 12-year-old, early teenage, sort of experience and taste. So I think that when you see a movie like Ghostbusters, the people who really love Ghostbusters are people who are in their 40s now. 40s and maybe early 50s. They're the ones who really love it because they saw it at a time when they were very susceptible to that sort of, thing. I saw it, I was in my 20s and I have some fond memories of it, but it's not a touchstone movie for me. There are no touchstone movies for me really from the 80s. Maybe Platoon, that's because of professional connections. That's one of the first movies I reviewed. Purple Rain. There are a few movies that I really like, but I don't have that sort of visceral attachment to them like I do to the movies that I saw in the early 70s, about the time when I was 12 years old. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, Conversation, I've got Dog Day Afternoon. A lot of movies, Outlaw Josie Wales, a lot of movies like that. Those are my sweet spot, and I suspect I overrate those movies because when I first saw them, and I first saw them in theaters, I was like, around 12 years old. I was in that sweet spot where I was really susceptible to the form. I hadn't become jaded yet. I hadn't become so movie smart. Paris left. Audi's still over here. I hadn't become so movie smart that I could see around the sides of them and started thinking about how they were put together. They were still kind of magical to me. But at the same time, I was old enough to kind of get that they were made things, and to get the coolness of them, to get the idea that these guys who were on screen weren't really just the guys on screen. They were also, actors who had this life and this lifestyle off the screen, which seemed kind of interesting and cool too. So I think there's something special about movies that you see when you're at that age. Now, what that brings me to, though, is the past couple of generations. You can see any movie when you're 12 years old. I mean, you can go back and see Ferris Bueller's Day Off, or The Goonies, or The Sandlot, or any of these touchstone films like Ghostbusters when you're 12 years old. And if you've got a dad who saw those movies when he was 12 years old, he's probably going to, want you to see these movies at this time. And so now, instead of just taking whatever comes to the box office through the theater every weekend, like when I grew up, or people who are maybe in their 40s and 50s grew up, now, you've got this sort of dynamic where, you don't go to the theater that often. And when you do go to the theater, it's a big deal. But you have the chance to sample, basically from 100 years of film at home. And I wonder if that's going to change the taste of people. I think you're going to have these echoes, these vibrations, because you're going to have the 45-year-old dad showing his 12-year-old kid Ghostbusters. And that's going to kind of create this cultural ripple for Ghostbusters. It's going to go on for another generation. I've always thought it was fascinating that we would listen to music. Like, I listen to music now, typically, or often. Often, I listen to music that's 50 years old. Now, when I was a kid, I can't imagine anybody in the 70s listening to music from the 1920s. I can't imagine anyone in the 80s listening to music from the 1930s. Now, I know there were people who did. And I know that that there were some forms that sort of transcend the temporal kind of plane, and you can, get in Charlie Christian anytime, uh, but it just seemed really weird if I'd ever run across anybody who was listening to music that's 50 years old. And now I would dare say that most of my cohort listens to music that's at least that old really often. If you listen to Arkansas Rocks, you're going to hear a lot of songs that are 40 and 50 years old. Okay. And that's fine. That's fine. Especially since I have some thoughts about, the way music has been going. And that I really do think there was a big change in the way music was marketed and sold right around, 1970, 75, somewhere in there. I really do think that, as T-Bone Burnett says, they started to figure out how to market music to people who didn't really care for music. But we're getting the same thing with movies now. We're getting the same thing. I mean, we're going to have kids who are 17 years old and just love, Bill Murray in Caddyshack and Bill Murray in Ghostbusters and things like that. Now, I don't know what it means. I just know it's interesting. And it's something that maybe we ought to think about a little bit. I don't know. It always seems to me like the movies we make for kids are really, we really should do better. There are very few good ones. I mean, the Studio Ghibli stuff, the Japanese anime stuff that Disney imported during the 90s and early 2000s, Spirited Away and things like that. Those are great. And those are great, frightening, kind of stories made for children. But we don't have some. We just don't consistently produce those in Hollywood. American films don't really produce those kinds of movies. I'm thinking Jay Russell's made two great movies for kids, My Dog Skip and The Water Horse. But other than that, I can't think of too many really good kids movies. I mean, I guess there are a lot of them that I don't care for. I mean, I guess maybe that's the qualifier here that I like, and that would also seem to be made for kids. So, anyway, but you've got this whole library now of stuff you can show your kids. You can indoctrinate your kid any way you want. You could probably turn him into a Roy Rogers fan if you wanted to. Well, anyway, that's this week's On Film. Thanks for Paris and Audi for showing up, at least for a minute. We'll probably talk more about this particular subject later because it's sort of something that I'm just sort of, kind of rolling around my head. If you have any thoughts, you can leave a comment. You can send me an email. You can leave a comment on Facebook where this will be. You can do whatever you want to do. But I'd really appreciate some feedback and hope you're doing well and are getting through this COVID stretch, which looks like it's going to last for a while now. Looks like we're going to be doing this into 2021, I think. But not to be the bearer of bad news. You already know that. So anyway, take care. We'll talk to you later. And thanks.